Cue the dramatic music. We are going to be talking about root knot nematodes today, the arch nemesis of all Florida gardeners. End of story. If you're a new gardener, maybe you don't know about them yet. But if you're an experienced gardener here, they are a thing and you know it. This is like Joker and Batman having this constant, unending, never fixable battle. But there are some tools that you can put into your arsenal that will help you deal with these incredibly destructive pests. Nematodes are essentially like a chunky smoothie. If you've ever had a blender that just wasn't up to par and you go to make your, breakfast smoothie, you put your straw in the smoothie, you go to drink, and you get little bits of date or spinach or whatever stuck in the straw and you can't drink it. That is essentially what is happening to the plant roots. The roots are the straws for the plant. That is what takes up out of the soil all of the nutrients and the water, the food essentially, for that plant to grow big and strong. But if they have clogs from these root knot nematodes, they can't access it. So what happens is these little teeny tiny microscopic worms work their way into the root, and then they populate and grow and essentially fill up the straw. When that happens, you're going to start to see your plants looking a little yellow, like, oh, maybe a fertilizer deficiency. Maybe they get a little bit wilty, even though you watered appropriately. Basically, it's a sign that your plants aren't getting what they need. So even if you're doing everything right, you could still end up with major problems, reduced yields, or potentially, depending on the severity, even plants dying. Not a good scenario. And that is why we are going to talk about how you can reduce, never eliminate, the populations of root knot nematodes in your garden so that you can successfully grow your food here in Florida. Let's start with what not to do. And that's the thing that pretty much everybody does when they think that they have nematodes or root knot nematodes. And that is solarize your soil. Please don't do it. In organic gardening, soil biology is everything. I have an entire video that discusses all of the amazing benefits that it has for your garden. When you solarize the soil, you are killing off everything, not just the bad guys. In fact, very few nematodes are actually harmful or negative in the garden. The vast majority of the thousands and thousands of types of garden nematodes there are, they're all benign or beneficial. And you don't just kill the nematodes with the solarizing, you're also killing off all of the fungi, all of the bacteria, all of the living stuff that needs to be there. It just doesn't make sense. So don't solarize your soil, please. Now, on the other hand, we can actually support that relationship. In organic gardening, we are trying to recreate a natural system as best as we are able in a permaculture garden. So rather than fight it, we support the entire thing so that it can find its own natural balance. How do we do this? One thing, not solarizing the soil. Two is allowing them to create a healthy and robust ecosystem. If we are supporting those bacteria and fungi and beneficial nematodes and all of that to establish in the soil by not tilling, not solarizing, not using synthetic chemical fertilizers, those kinds of things, all of the stuff that is naturally occurring in our environment finds a happy home and it stays there. There's a multitude of studies that have shown the difference between having a healthy soil ecosystem and an unhealthy one, or devoid, dead soil essentially. The production is astronomical between the two when everything else is kept the same. So needless to say, soil life matters. How do we boost it or supercharge it? You can use whole organics, which is basically soil life in a bottle that you can apply to the soil. And it basically just, kickstarts it or is like a boost. Compost, obviously #1 resource, but if you don't have large quantities of it, or if for whatever reason you're not able to compost, that might not be an option. That's where something like Organics could come into play. The other place you can look is Arbico Organics. They're a well-known, reputable, beneficial insect dealer. That is what they specialize in. That's what they do. And you can actually order beneficial nematodes to just simply inoculate your soil with. I can't tell you how many times I've heard frustrated gardeners say, I'm over it, I'm just growing in pots. And it's something that can kind of sort of help, but it's a common misconception. So, quick rundown. Root knot nematodes, all nematodes, tend to live in the top 6 inches of soil. So if they live in the top 6 inches of the soil, our native soil, if we do not have, let's say, a raised bed or in-ground beds, we, in theory, should be preventing them from getting into our containers. So if you have a patio and you put, your green stock or grow bags or whatever you grow in theory, it will dramatically reduce it. But this is kind of like, germs in school or whatever. Like, these things aren't immobile. They can move. They will move. And if you take compost that you made in your backyard and then put it into your container, you just introduced good bad nematodes and bad nematodes. If you buy the soil from Home Depot and it's sitting out in the back and they throw it in, you put it into your container, that's been in contact with the native soil. So to think that just because you're growing in containers, you're going to completely eliminate this issue, it may slow it down, it may delay it, but it's not preventing it. So don't think just by growing in these that you've got some foolproof solution to dealing with root knot nematodes. Nematodes like sandy, well-drained soil with temperatures that rarely, if ever, drop to freezing. Hello, most of Florida and the southern United States. This is native and perfectly normal and natural for our area, but obviously less than supportive for us growers. So how do we deal with this growing condition when it's something that naturally occurs? And the best way to do so is to increase the organic matter. Now, if you're growing in a raised bed, that's not going to be an issue. You're already going to be bringing in bulk soil. You're going to be adding compost, coconut coir, all sorts of soil amendments that are going to help to increase the organic matter and the moisture retention. But if you're going to be growing in the ground, let's say in ground, because they can affect fruit trees and other things as well as vegetables, or potentially even mounded rows on the ground, to minimize the amount of sandy soil that these nematodes can thrive in, we want to do something like either adding a lot of compost or potentially sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is a fantastic way to increase the organic matter, which then increases the amount of moisture in the soil for free. So this is a great technique and one tool that you can use to minimize the prevalence of nematodes in your garden area. A great way to counteract or deal with nematodes, root knot nematodes, is to be selective with your varieties. So there are varieties of plants that are more susceptible to nematodes. If we're looking at heirlooms from the northern half of the country, they don't have nematode pressure like we do here. And so they're probably not going to be as well equipped to deal with those situations. Peppers are all nightshades, but peppers are susceptible to root knot nematodes. So planting hot peppers, bell pepper, California Wonder, everybody always plants California Wonder bell peppers. They're incredibly sensitive to root knot nematodes. So if you plant instead Carolina rather than California, Carolina like North Carolina, those have been bred specifically for their root knot nematode resistance. If you do a little bit of research and find those varieties, you're putting in the best plant for the job given the conditions. Even with resistant varieties, when and as your plants die out. I am a big fan for no-till gardening. Most of the time, if it's not a sensitive crop, I will cut the plant at the base rather than pulling all of the roots out of the soil, because it helps to support that soil biology I was talking about. But if it is a nematode sensitive variety, your nightshades, okra, something like that, I do actually recommend the opposite, which is to remove roots and all, because that is harboring the root knot nematodes. And so you're giving them a home and food for just a little while longer. If you see an infestation, bumpy roots, do not compost it unless you are 110% positive that you have a hot compost pile between 140 and 160 for 4 weeks or longer. Better to err on the side of caution if you have any sort of question about that. Do not compost infected roots, because then your compost is going to be seeding them right back into your garden. Crop rotation is another fantastic method for reducing and potentially even temporarily eliminating root knot nematodes from the garden. Now, there are varieties of crops like tomatoes and okra that are super susceptible and are like magnets for them. There are other crops which seem to be immune to them or kind of repulsive and don't seem to really be infected by them hardly ever. Something like mustard or strawberries, alliums, garlic, anything like that, corn, aren't bothered by them. And so the theory here with crop rotation is that we are able to not plant something that they do use for food for a long enough period of time that they die out. So if we can go ideally 3 to 4 years, but even 2 is going to be helpful, planting crops and rotating things through the garden. Now, I hear all the time, especially with small space urban gardeners, they immediately throw crop rotation out the window and they say, oh, I don't have that many beds, or I don't have 4 beds, I can't do it. Even just breaking a single raised bed into quarters is going to be more helpful than not. Anything to tip it in your favor, even just a little bit, will be helpful. So think outside the box with your crop rotation. Perhaps it's, you have 2 raised beds and some containers. So maybe you plant in 1 raised bed all of your sensitive crops, then the next year in your other raised bed, and then in the 3rd year you move it to the containers, so on and so forth. There's always a way to get creative with your crop rotation, and it does not have to be this super defined large scale concept that most people put crop rotation into. So in the same vein as crops that are less appealing food for them, we actually have cover crops which can repel them. Planting things like sorghum here, marigolds, or sun hemp are all things that we can grow over the summer months, which typically is a lesser utilized growing season here in Florida, and it will repel the nematodes. Now, this is studies done at universities and all sorts of stuff showing the effects of various chemical components within that plant that actually kill off and repel these root knot nematodes. Now, these can affect all nematodes, so it should be used with, that in mind. Now, I do have a summer cover crop blend that includes these as well as a couple other plants that I love to grow during the summer months. You can get that in my online shop, but what's interesting about them and what's really important to understand is just planting them is not going to get rid of the nematodes. Simply having a marigold growing at the foot of a tomato plant is going to do next to nothing for you. What has the highest concentration of those chemical compounds, which do actually kill off and affect the nematodes, it's in the leaf matter. So just having the roots intertwined with the tomato roots is doing nothing for you. When you're using a cover crop to repel or kill nematodes, you need to actually be incorporating this into your soil to get any sort of lasting effect. Now, depending on the quantity used and all of that, anywhere from 3 to 6 months should see reduced nematode populations. But what I like to do is I will cut all of this material down, the sun hemp, the sorghum, the marigolds, and I use it as a chop and drop, which basically means kind of like a mulch on top of the soil where I will soon be planting my fall crops. When I use this, the chemical components in these plants are starting to break down into the soil. Right before planting, I come through, top off with a couple inches of fresh compost, and then plant my plants. That is what is going to help with the nematodes, not having the plants growing next to the sensitive plants. Something you will likely see a lot of organic gardeners recommend for dealing with root knot nematodes is crab meal. The chitin, which is in the shell of the crabs, is very effective at breaking the life cycle of the nematodes. It does something to the shell of the egg of the nematodes. It deteriorates it, they can't reproduce, and so the nematode population is kept in check or reduced. Now, I have two caveats with this. It is effective, but it is also affecting the beneficials as well, and we have talked about why it is so important to establish a robust soil ecosystem. So with that in mind, the other thing is the quantity needed to be effective is quite high. The average 4x6 bed is going to need about 2.5 pounds worth of crab meal worked into the soil. That's like maybe $9–10 worth of crab meal per bed, so not a super cheap amendment. It does break down slower, so it will be in the soil for a while, but my preferred approach because of that is to use it in ones that are especially sensitive. So typically for me, I use it for tomatoes and okra. So what I do is when I go to plant those plants into the garden bed, I'll just take a couple of tablespoons, a small handful of the crab meal, put it directly into the planting pocket with that tomato or with that okra. That way I have localized control. It helps the plants get established and to thrive, but I'm not necessarily doing anything that's widespread throughout the bed. Now, if you want links to anything that I've mentioned here that can be helpful for dealing with root knot nematodes, the crab meal, the organics, whatnot, I do have links below, and by shopping through those, it does help to support the work that I do here at the channel at no extra cost to you. So if that's of interest, head on down to the show notes. Just like Batman and the Joker, we as Florida gardeners are going to be destined to battle it out with these root knot nematodes forever. It's just a reality. I want to be abundantly clear. These tools that I taught you will absolutely help you to manage or maintain your territory within your garden space, but none of it is foolproof and none of it is the smoking gun, so to speak. So make sure to implement as many of these different concepts into your garden plan as possible so that you have an abundant and successful harvest, even in the southern United States.